Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you in our new podcast by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, Planet Profit. Welcome back to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. This is Juan, Cornelius Seed Innovation Lead, and I'm joined by Craig Allaman, our lead agronomist. In this episode, we're going to bring you a corn and soybean crop update from fields across Iowa into northwest Illinois and southeast Wisconsin. We'll also share valuable insights on the impact of this early season drought stress and discuss key growth stages and important pests and diseases to scout for. Morning, Craig.
Thank you, Juan. Good to be here.
Good, thank you. So let's just dive right in. Could you give us a brief overview of just the current crop conditions and what you've been seeing? And really, I know what's on top of everybody's mind is that early season drought stress. Let's get started. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, well, pretty much widespread across our footprint. So you think about the state of Iowa into the northern half of Illinois and then southern Wisconsin. We've got various degrees of an early summer drought looking at us. So we'll kind of dive into that a little bit and talk about, I think, where we see that right now. But we've had some spotty rains here last few days. So if you've gotten some of those, you feel blessed, but there's a lot of areas that have not. I think probably a lot of what we're seeing started with really windy conditions, in that last part of March into April when we were planting. I know the surface moisture was pretty dry, kind of all the way through. Made for some good soil conditions, but I know we were chasing moisture, in that early planting window right after Easter. So that top, few inches has remained pretty dry. I do think we've got, in a lot of areas, we've got some pretty good subsoil moisture. I see creeks still running pretty good that are tile fed, things like that. So I think there's moisture down there. And if this crop is rooted down and getting into that, I think it's doing better than if it's, let's say some later planted stuff that the roots haven't gotten down, to some of that subsoil moisture yet. So there's going to be some variation there, like there always is. And, I think we'll see some differences in planting dates, as a result of that. But early summer droughts, soybeans, we don't generally worry too much about that because they've got a lot of ways to make, to make up stress later on in the season. But corn, we will worry a lot more about corn on drought stress at several different times through the years. But if you think of where we're at right now, corn is determining rows around, probably initiates that in V4, but definitely finishes it in the V5 stage. And so the early planted corn is probably, V7, V8 by now. That first week in May when we got a lot of crop planted, that stuff's I've seen a lot of that stuff at the V6 stage. So, we've just went through that. So you kind of think back, what was my stress like at that point? But even though we've determined rows around, so let's say we've got 18 rows on an ear, that's what the plant has decided it could do at that stage, we can still pinch those rows back. If you think back when we used to use a lot of ALS herbicides in corn, we used to stress that corn and pinch those rows back with a herbicide, but that can happen with any kind of stress. So drought stress this time of the year could make that row determination less, or pinch it down even after it has determined that. So those are just some of the things that we always look at. What's my crop like at the V5 stage? And then at V12, what's it like? Because that's when we're determining potential number of kernels per row. And then, of course, what's it like at pollination and then during grain fill. So early summer drought is maybe not as bad as a grain fill drought that we would have in August, but it's always a bit of a concern. And So we talk about what can we do to mitigate that. And, sometimes guys will throw something in with their herbicides. At this time of the year, a lot of that goes on at that V4, V5, V6 stage. And, it might be something like a plant growth regulator. A lot of your retailers will carry a brand of a PGR, or, might be an ethylene inhibitor to stop that production of ethylene gas. That the plant, that's kind of a signal for the plant to start shutting down. But also just a fungicide application. We've talked a lot about the value of a fungicide at tasseling time frame for stress mitigation. And the strobilurin portion of most of the fungicides we use can be a very good stress reliever. And so, at tasseling time frame, we're trying to keep those kernels from aborting and reduce that stress during that time period when we're determining kernel depth. But at this time of the year, it can also be a good stress reliever. So if you're thinking about or thought about using say a V5 application of a fungicide in your program, and then coming back and using a fungicide again at tasseling, this would be a good year possibly to do that. Or, a lot of times anything we've talked about it, whether it's a plant growth regulator, I had a field, had my local FS that I use for my own. They put on Periscope is the name of their PGR product. So, they talk about it driving root and shoot growth. So, getting that, getting those roots to grow a little faster, a little deeper, and helping just that, that growth, cell elongation and so forth, but also as a stress mitigation. So, I have a whole field that I've applied that to, and it's I picked that field out because I know a couple fields next to it. They're always very, very close in yield, so I should get a pretty good indication, what that has done for me. So this might be the year to try something like that, especially in the face of an early summer drought that we have.
So on the fungicide, and I think, a comment or a thought I had whenever you were talking about the early season drought, not as painful as the one during tasseling. I think that especially at the V5 stage, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're talking because the growing point is still below the ground at that point, right?
Well, it's not necessarily an effect on the growing point where the early season drought. The growing point being below the ground is important, mainly just if we get in a situation where we have a freeze or a frost event.
Okay.
Still protected there below the ground. So
okay. The your dog agrees with that, by the way. So and another thing that you or the pooch can help me with too is on the fungicide application. So I'm hearing that there's a couple of things that a person can do to help with to ease some of the drought stress on the plant, whether it's a plant growth regulator from your local retailer or a fungicide application. What other types of things or diseases could be occurring that we could be looking for that can make that decision easier? Or would someone want to apply fungicide just because it's going to help relieve stress? Or what other things can we look for that it will also benefit?
Well, early season diseases that we generally worry about, probably one of the main ones would be the anthracnose leaf blight. So anthracnose has several different forms that it can attack the plant. Early on there's a leaf blight, and then you can get the stalk rot, that we address with that VT application of a fungicide. It doesn't really control the anthracnose, but it makes the plant healthier, and the plant's able to fight that anthracnose off. And then late in the season, we get a top dieback. We can get a top dieback from the anthracnose, where you'll just see the top few leaves in the plants die back early. But so this early application could control that, that leaf blight portion. there's a few other early season diseases that we worry about, but making the plant healthier and able to fight off diseases is probably one of the big things that early application does for us, and just relieving stress at that time.
Okay. No, thanks for clarifying that for me. Well, moving on to soybeans, how has the dry weather impacted just what the crop looks like? I know you mentioned it's not as big of a concern for it right now, but just so we kind of recap back on beans.
Yeah, and corn. There's a half a dozen big events in that growth stage of corn that we really need to be hitting on all cylinders when we get there. Beans, not so much. I mean, we've seen. Well, we see this year with some of the pounding rains we've had after soybean planting. We've had a lot of replant. We just had soil crusting, and that surface, of course, dried out really quick, like we've talked about. But we see beans that try to pull through that crack and can't get the cotyledons through, and they pop off, or the neck breaks. But some of these where the cotyledons have popped off, that cotyledon node is still there, and it'll go ahead and activate the axillary buds at that cotyledon node and develop a pretty normal plant. So that's just an example of how resilient a soybean plant is, and how different the growth stage is, or the growth cycle is, for a soybean versus a corn plant. It can have a lot of injury early in the season and still be able to compensate by activating. Every node has axillary buds, and if the plant gets injured above, let's say the main growing point, the apical meristem gets injured, those axillary buds will kick in and develop a fairly normal plant. So it's an amazing plant. We get frustrated by soybeans sometimes because we can't manage it as many ways as we can corn, but at the same sense, it can do some amazing things for us under stress conditions. So not too worried about the early season stress with soybeans. They've got a lot of time to compensate. I will comment on the early planted soybeans. So we started planting here about the 10th of April, the day after Easter, I believe was the 10th. So those soybeans, in the early planted soybean world, what we're trying to do is to get to the V3 stage by the time we get the night length that we need on the early side of the summer solstice. So we used to always flower on the back side of the summer solstice when we got that night length that particular soybean variety would need. And with this early planting, if we could get to V3 by that same time frame before the summer solstice, so somewhere around mid-June, we can start flowering if we get enough growth. And so I checked that particular field. It was a 2136 an enlist bean from Cornelius, and planted there at around Little York, Illinois, on the 10th of April. And I checked it on May 31st, and I was at V5 already.
Oh my!
So I'm going to be cranking V7-ish, probably, maybe V8 by the time that window gets here where I need to start flowering. And so I'm going to flower early, but those plants just have a bigger factory when it starts flowering, to photosynthesize. So I'm expecting good things out of that. Of course, if we continue to get moisture, and particularly have good moisture in August, which is very important for the grain fill on the soybeans. So,
well, that's awesome. We're relatively new into the Twitter space as a company, even me, myself as a user, and it's been pretty neat to see when we talked about this. What was it? I think last Friday or Thursday. I started seeing those images popping up of folks showing their flowers. So it's looks like it's gonna be, hopefully it'll be a good year for that momentum keeps going.
Yeah, and while we're on soybeans, so we don't forget, and we're in the month of June, everybody needs to remember that the EPA has passed new laws for the spraying of dicamba on the Extend Flex soybeans. And instead of June 20th like it was last year, it's June 12th now in Illinois, Indiana, in our Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. So our South Dakota growers, I think they have moved that to June 20th instead of the 30th, which it was last year. So we don't have much time left to get that spray on. So just need to be aware of that. And, the reason that they moved it forward is because they wanted to get away from those hotter days when that dicamba had a better opportunity to volatilize and move off target, move out of the field that it was sprayed into. But of course, we have plenty of 90-degree temps right now, so that's probably still a concern. But that was the reason for moving that date.
Oh, okay. Well, that's thank you for highlighting that. We'll also put that on nice and prominent on the podcast notes. That's a pretty important reminder there. June 12th, application deadline for spraying dicamba. Thank you. I know Janie will appreciate that.
Yeah, that was a point Janie brought up. So I don't know if Janie's dad is spraying dicamba or what made her remember that, but great. That was a great catch.
Absolutely. All right, so let's see here. So, well, we've got a little update on the crop as a whole. Just kind of another thought or just question on that is amidst all this stress, how do you think things look? I realize a lot of stuff can change, and even at trainings, you mentioned to the team it's important to take notes during certain stages. Like what was the weather like when knee-high corn when the corn was knee-high and when the rows were being determined, and how about shoulder height corn? So there's always these important parts of the season that are going to matter. So a lot can change is what I'm trying to say, but overall, just with your experience and decades of experience, I'm not trying to age you here, but how are you feeling about this year so far?
Well, we've got a long ways to go yet. I would prefer that we weren't going through this drought stress. I'd prefer that we didn't have, a lot of the soil crusting where we've had emergence issues for sure. And it's going to depend on where you're at. There's some pretty good looking crops around, and there's some pretty average looking crops around. And, we're still going through some of that ugly time period in the corn where it's uneven and the colors we got a lot of yellowing out there, and we will grow through that eventually and probably haven't been hurt tremendously by that. But, we want to set expectations for, as a seed company for our customers, but as farmers, we want to kind of know what to expect out there through the growing season. These crops are tough. They've been bred to be tough, over the last couple of decades, so we can handle some pretty good stress. But the early planted stuff, we we had that early planting window right around Easter and the week after Easter, and got a fair amount of crop in some places where soil temps were warm enough. And so you'd think, well, that's might be our best crop window, but we'll just keep an eye on that. I have done stand counts in our corn that we planted that week, and we were dropping 34,500. We've got 31 to 32,000 plants out there. We were real careful to shut down and get away from that imbibitional chilling in a couple of those windows early on, but we did not expect to have that extended cold temps. That wasn't in the forecast when we planted, and so we just lost some stand due to just regular cold injury. We were leafing out under the ground is what we were doing. So we've lost some stand that way. What's there looks tremendous, and it's rooted down pretty good by now. So probably making it through this this drought stress that we're having right now a little bit better than the later planted. But when we finished up that first week in May, we didn't end up getting any pounding rains after that. So we probably got if I planted 34,500, I've probably got at least 34 out there. So that may end up being a better planting date than our early stuff. We'll just see as the season progresses. But we want to set expectations. So we get to the fall, we get in the combine, and we're 20 bushel off what we think we should be because of the weather we had later on. We need to remember back to this early season stress. So that's kind of why we always try to try to get a good barometer as we go through the season, so we can know what the end results were of.
No, well, thank you for that. And as you said, there's plenty of season left, and I know with plenty of season left, that something that you that's important and you push quite a bit is to get out there and scout often, and don't get into just that edge of the field. Get in there nice and deep. So what are some signs or symptoms that as we're out there scouting, that we should be looking for when scouting a cornfield right now? I know that you've talked about in the past that when you start to see fireflies, lightning bugs, that that's kind of when we start thinking about corn rootworm, and but I'm kind of curious just what your thoughts are now, that what should we be looking for, and what have you been seeing?
Well, that's a really good question. I'll address the rootworm real quickly, and then I'll address what you triggered in my mind with your question there. So we've been seeing, I'm down here on Highway 34, so it goes across Illinois and Iowa both, so you can get an idea where I'm at, north to south, temp wise and things like that. But we've been seeing fireflies for a couple weeks now, and that's just a good indicator. That's just when we've had enough heat units to get the eggs of the corn rootworm hatched. And so the larva stage, where that rootworm is in the larva stage, is where the damage gets done. And so they're going to feed for most of the month of June on the corn roots if they're not controlled. And so we'll be able to do root digs here in a week or 2 or 3, and kind of get an indication what kind of control methods we've used have worked, and what kind of injury we could expect, and do need to plan on spraying for beetles before they clip our silks, at the tasseling time frame. So there's a lot of things we can do with that pest. We've got the new rootworm, the Smart Stacks Pro, with the new rootworm RNAi technology that we're very excited about. And so we'll follow up on that and see how that's doing. We've had a couple years worth of experience with it, and think it's definitely a step change in control of the rootworm. So, but your question triggered me. What do we when we see things out there? What are we looking for? What are we trying to determine happen? And I've seen plenty of this recently. When you see nutrient deficiency on the plant, the first thing that I'm going to want to do is dig that plant up carefully and see what's happening under the ground, because 9 times out of 10, a nutrient deficiency on the leaves, and most recently, I've seen potash deficiency on some of this corn. That's a good example. I have seen some on beans as well. And potash deficiency will usually be yellowing and then browning of the leaf margin. So on the outside edges, you're going to see that yellowed up and then eventually browned up as that leaf material dies. And so we want to dig those roots up and see what's going on underneath the ground. And it can, especially in a year like this, it can just simply be that the roots are sitting in dry soils for a period of time. And, since we have this kind of early season flash drought going on here, that's probably what is happening in a lot of these cases. There's not enough roots that are down into the soil moisture where they can get to the nutrients, and they're sitting in dry soil. And so we're going to see some nutrient deficiencies. Those will be temporary. And, when we get some rain, or when those roots get down further and get to those nutrients, that'll disappear. So, but that's always the case when you see a nutrient deficiency. What's going on with my roots? Do I have rootworm feeding? Do I have compacted soils where the roots aren't growing like they should? I did dig some corn up the other day that was showing some nutrient deficiency, and you had that kind of that tomahawk root growth in that slot, that planter slot. We had sidewall wall compaction when it was planted, and so those roots are not growing out very well and not getting to a great amount of the nutrients that should be available to it. So That's always what you want to do when you see a nutrient deficiency, is what's going on underneath the ground. That'll usually answer your question.
Got it. Thank you. So, as we're scouting, and like you said, you might see some ugly corn, and you identify there might be some nutrient deficiency. And we talked about a little bit on the corn rootworm pressure. Is it too early to talk about, oh boy, gray leaf spot and some of those other foliar diseases?
It's not, because that's kind of the next thing that's right around the corner. So we want to start, we want to be scouting for foliar disease that week ahead of tasseling. If that's our target date to spray at that R1 stage, then we need to know ahead of time what we need to spray for, unless it's just part of our program that we're planning on doing. So gray leaf, we got about 5 heavy hitters that we generally have every year. There's more, of course, but we look for gray leaf spot. We look for northern corn leaf blight. We look for both rust, the southern and the common. And now we look for tar spot every year as well. It's probably becoming one of our more consistent diseases that we have. But when we think about those diseases, there's the two that come under cooler conditions. So we kind of usually look for earlier in the summer are going to be a northern corn leaf blight and a common rust. And then the gray leaf and the southern, they're going to want those warmer conditions, which we're actually having right now, of course. And then tar is also more moderate. We usually don't see tar early in the summer, but we always need to have our eyes open for it. We usually see that, more in that August time frame when we start having cooler evenings where we get a lot of dew and things like that. But all of these fungal diseases are going to need to have moisture. So right now, when we're in this dry period, that's maybe one of the only positive things about it. We've got to have leaf wetness for certain periods of time for these things to get going. So we're probably safe for now, but as soon as we start getting some rain and stuff, we need to be out there looking for that ahead of tasseling time frame.
Okay. Oh, thank you for that. And I know we follow Eric Snodgrass from Nutrient, and he covers gives some very wonderful weather updates and great commentary on ag, and didn't seem like there was a whole lot coming down the pipeline this week. So, but
Yeah.
some things might be shaking and moving. The further you get out there,
Yeah,
the outlook.
the rust, all those diseases we talked about will overwinter on residue, and they'll be here except the rust. The rust have to live on live tissue. So where we get rust spores is storms that come up from the south. Okay, so 2 years ago we had some pretty bad southern rust. We got knocked pretty hard here in western Illinois, so I was kind of hypersensitive to it last year, and I watched every storm that came in to see which one was going to come up from the Gulf and bring more rust up. And last year, most everything originated out of the Pacific, and I think I saw one rust pustule in all the corn I was in last year. So that's something we can kind of look at to proactively determine if we're going to have a rust outbreak, is where these storms are coming from. These popcorn things here that we've had last few days, I honestly don't know where they're coming from, but it's definitely not a big system that's moving up through the Gulf. So I'd say we're safe so far on the rust, but that's a good indicator that you can keep track of through the year.
Well, that's good. That's a nice little tip. And as far as those little popcorn sales, I'm a firm believer those are folks out there rain dancing or praying, one of the two or both.
Well, I better get going then. Huh?
Yeah, I've got a video posted out there to give you some demonstrations if you need help. Well, and anything in the soybean landscape as to what pests or diseases we would want to keep an eye out at when we're out there scouting at this point?
Pretty good shape. I mean, early season bean leaf beetle, feeding on soybeans is probably about the only thing that happens too early. But, most of our fully treated soybeans will protect against that. And you've got to have a tremendous amount to even be concerned about early on. We worry about later generations in August during grain fill when we're worried about them feeding on pods and so forth. So we're pretty good shape on the soybean pest front, I think, right now. And again, it's that August time frame when we might be spraying a fungicide if we've got Japanese beetles prevalent. And, insects in general with a really, really mild winter have seemed to be heavier so far. So we'll see how that turns out. I'm hoping we don't have a big year of Japanese beetle damage, but certainly could be. We didn't lose much to winter freezing this year.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on that. That's for sure. Craig, I think that wraps up our early season crop update and our discussion around scouting for pests and diseases. Is there any additional advice, or what's a key takeaway you'd like for our listeners to leave with from what we talked about today?
Well, I think just we talked a lot about paying attention to what the conditions are all through the year. And you mentioned earlier we talk a lot about knee high, shoulder high. Knee high, generally speaking, is around that V5 stage, but the next one will be shoulder high, which is V12, and V12 is when that length of kernels per row is determined. So hopefully, even if we've stressed this early on time period, when you're paying attention to shoulder high corn necks, we'll have some good moisture and make up some ground there. We'll do rows around, we do length of rows, we do the next big one for, these are all ways that a corn ear will flex. So then the next one is how many kernels we get pollinated, and then how many we keep. Do we abort some of those back? But then we can gain a great amount in kernel depth. That first couple weeks after pollination is pretty key for that. And then we finish out with just the weight in each kernel, during grain fill, how much weight we put on. So even if we've lost a little bit here, we've got time to regain some of that back. So just say keep praying and or rain dancing in your case, and hopefully we'll make the lost ground up as the season goes here.
Well, I appreciate that, Craig, and I think it was just also helpful to know that amidst this drought stress, if the operation allows and it's the best decision for each individual person, you talked about you can tap into some plant growth regulators, or maybe that fungicide application to relieve some stress, just to have that healthier looking crop. Not looking at healthier crops so it can handle disease better, which I'm curious to follow some of that stuff that had the Pivot Bio put on with it throughout the season. I also realized that the microbial stuff works best under certain conditions, and so but we'll see how that product fared when this year concludes.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a school of thought that when droughty conditions and we've got nitrogen unavailable, or we've lost some, or whatever it may be, that having those microbes in there still producing nitrogen is a pretty good deal. So should be a good year to test it.
Yeah, that's for sure. So, well, folks, thank you for taking a moment to listen to our podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to it, and you can check us out on social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter, and find us by looking up Planet Profit or Cornelius Seed. Until the next one, thank you.